A rotary cutter is basically a rolling blade, which is going to cut fabric for you. A rotary cutter is a tool made up of a blade and a handle, which holds the blade in place, and it has a retractable blade cover. Now, they come in 3 basic sizes: 60 mil, 45 mil, and 28 mil. And they all have specific purposes, but as a beginner, I would suggest that you purchase the 45 millimeter blade. It's the most versatile. Now, the 60 millimeter blade is a little bit cumbersome for a beginner, but it is wonderful if you're cutting thick items like batting, which has a bit more loft to it than regular fabric. 45 mil is a good all-purpose, and the 28 mil comes in really handy when you're doing small work or using a template where you have to get around a curve. Now, a 45 mil blade would not fit in there, would not be able to turn. So you can see where that little guy might come in handy too. When you purchase your rotary cutter, be sure to keep the instructions on how to change the blade, because you can change the blades in your rotary cutters. Now, they are deadly sharp, so be very careful. But just follow those instructions to disassemble your rotary cutter, add your blade, and then put it back together. Prior to 1980, there were no rotary cutters. They were invented around that time. So if you're working with old patterns from grandma or somebody, they're going to tell you to be using scissors and working with templates. But nowadays, unless you're doing something very specific like applique work, you're probably going to use a rotary cutter to cut the pieces for your quilt. Now, there's a specific way to hold a rotary cutter. What you want to do is place your index finger on the ridge, which is kind of a rough finish here. You want to just wrap your hand around the handle, and you're going to open your blade. Now, some rotary cutters have a button open. Some, if you squeeze a handle, it will open. But this is a very manual one with less pieces to break, and you just slide to open your blade. So with my index finger here and my hand wrapped around it and a ruler, I would run the ruler on the edge of the ruler, or run the rotary cutter on the edge of the ruler to cut away from me. You never want to cut towards yourself. It's very difficult to do that, and there's more chance of you actually cutting yourself. When you are done with a cut with your rotary cutter, you always want to shut the blade. Never leave the blade open. Never leave the rotary cutters around. Always put them away, because somebody may come across them, some young person, and harm themselves. So it's really, really important to be careful with the rotary cutter. And remember, always shut that blade. Do not wave your hands around with the blade open. You might end up cutting somebody. Shut the blade with every single cut. It's a good idea to practice with your rotary cutter on a mat without fabric, just to get the feel of it. It should run very smoothly. There should be no catches, and you have to be particularly careful about not dropping your rotary cutter, because it could damage the blade, or inadvertently running over a pin, which will notch the blade. And then whenever you cut with it, whenever that notch comes up as the circular motion progresses, you'll have threads that are not cut. So it is important to look after your blades. They are somewhat expensive, so you want to be careful with them so that they last a long time. Even though your blade is deadly sharp when purchased, it will dull over time. It'll give you hundreds and hundreds of cuts, but it will dull. Some things that will especially dull it are cutting synthetic fabrics, so that if you are using a rotary cutter to cut around pattern pieces for dress wear, let's say, it might dull a little faster. Or of course, if you run over a pin. If you run over a pin, your rotary blade is history. You cannot sharpen that groove out of it. There are sharpeners you can purchase for rotary blades that are simply dull, not notched, and we do carry those in our shop. The brand I most recommend is Olfa brand. It's an excellent brand, and you will have absolutely no troubles with it. As well, I use Olfa mats, and when you're using a rotary cutter, you certainly need a mat in order to absorb the cut. Now, mats are made in a couple of different ways. This is a 3-ply mat, so if you were to look on the edge here, you'd see two hard outer surfaces and an inner softer surface. And these mats are called self-healing because when you make a cut, it will kind of cut through that top surface, but it's cushioned by the center surface and it sort of reseals itself. Mats generally have a grid on them, so they're divided into inches. And some of the mats will have an area where they're divided into 1/2 inches. And on the edge of the mat, they're divided into 1/8 inches. So you've got your inches, your 1/8 inches, your quarters, your halves, and so on. When you purchase a mat, it's important that you buy a mat as big as you can afford. The reason for this is you'll get more use out of a big mat. It will be way easier to use because your fabrics that you use for quilting are generally about 45 inches in width, and 45 inches of width folded on the length will fit onto this mat beautifully. I'll just demonstrate. So the mat I'm working with here is a 24 by 36 inch mat, and that's the one I would recommend you buy if you can afford it. So if I were cutting this piece of fabric, and let's say I wanted to make a cut along this edge, I could easily do that because the mat is large enough. But let's say this is the mat I bought. It's pretty difficult to cut a piece of fabric like this on a mat like that. The best you can do is kind of fold it in half and cut and hope for the best. Now you're working with 4 layers of fabric, and if your ruler isn't perfectly straight, you're going to get a little bit of a wow wherever there's a fold in this fabric. So although this little mat might be handy at my ironing board or near my sewing machine for little quick cuts, it's not the one I want to use most of the time to cut out my quilting pieces. So a mat is a very expensive piece of equipment. If you buy a good one. If you don't, you're going to regret it because you'll actually cut holes in your mat. But when you got a good mat, you want to care for it properly. You don't want to ruin it. And it is essential to keep these 3-ply mats flat at all times. If this wasn't on my table, let's say I might put it under my bed, I would never lean it up against a wall because it will kind of fold. And then that curve in it will be permanent, and you will never be able to get that out, and you will never be able to use your mat again to cut your fabrics. So that would be a terrible waste. When you take a mat with you to a class, if you've got a large mat you're bringing, you're going to want to have some trunk space for it. It'll go in first, and other things can go on top or pop it in the back of your van, but never try and roll it or prop it up against a wall or anything like that. It's got to be flat. So let's talk about quilting rulers. Quilting rulers come, of course, there are lots of different brands, and they're arranged somewhat differently, and they have different abilities and intricacies. So here we have one that has a blue grid, we have one that has white grid, and it has little rough dots on the back. This is a Creative Grids ruler, so things don't slip around so much. We have Omni Grid yellow, and we have Omni Grip green, which again has a bit more stability because it has a rougher surface at the back. It is your preference which color you want to use. It depends on your eyesight. So you're going to want to just check out your new ruler perhaps on a few different fabrics just to make sure that you can probably see it for all your cuts. Now the rulers are divided certainly into 1-inch increments and 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch and 1/8 of an inch. You often do have to use that 1/8 of an inch, so you want to be sure that you can actually see the markings on the ruler with some ease. There are little help aids available, like little dots you can place on a spot on your ruler so that you can see that 1/8 of an inch better. So if you have poor eyesight, that's an option as well. But it's again a matter of preference for your eyesight which ruler you're going to want to use. Rulers are made out of a clear acrylic plastic, and they are meant for that rotary cutter to run along the side with comparative ease. So you want to make sure your ruler is good quality. I'm using the Omni Grid here and the Omni Grip, which is the green one, and they have worked out really well for me. The basic rulers you're going to want as a beginner are these. you'll want a 6 or 6.5 by 24-inch rectangular ruler. That one's a must. You're going to want a 6 or 6.5-inch ruler, a square one. That one's a must. And this is a nice one to have as a beginner. It is the 12 by 6 or 6.5-inch ruler. The reason you need 3 rulers, you might be wondering, is because there are different cuts you're going to make on your fabric. So if we're cutting strips off a piece of fabric, we want the nice long ruler. Remember when I had that piece of fabric laying down? If I want to get across the whole strip, I need a long ruler. If I've got some strips cut, but then I need to cut some squares out of that strip, I just want a smaller ruler that's square, so I can cut 2.5-inch squares or 3-inch squares or whatever out of that without trying to do it with this great big ruler, which would be very awkward. And sometimes we want to cut long rectangles, but not as long as that, and it's just easier to work with a smaller rectangular ruler. Oh. What do you want? What's your name? Snoogie. Come on, you. Okay. Okay, back to it. So a couple of other rulers that I quite enjoy are a square ruler, a big one. So if I'm having to cut background blocks for a quilt, this is really, really handy. I also, this is a, what is it, a 16.5-inch ruler. I also have a 20.5-inch ruler for cutting out pieces for bag making. And then another great one, just handy for drawing lines or checking measurements, is the 1 by 12.5-inch ruler. There are hundreds of different kinds of rulers. This is a scallop edge ruler with a curved edge detail. There's all kinds of triangle rulers with different degree measurements on them. This is a 60 degree. There are rulers for cutting curves on things. The list goes on and on, but the basics I've told you about are the ones you're going to want to concern yourself with right now. So I hope this video has been helpful to you and you'll be confident going out and buying your own rotary cutting tools, rulers, cutters, and mats to make perfect strips and squares, all ready to make your very first wonderful quilt. Thanks for joining me. I'm Brenda Miller from the ABQ Sewing Studio. Like and subscribe me or visit me at my shop in Strathroy, Ontario, or visit me at shop.amongbrendasquilts.com to purchase what you need.